Good evening, my friends, and welcome. The last time I did a fireside, I was standing up, and I got so many comments that said, just sit down. So tonight, I'm sitting down, and I'm making myself just as comfortable as I possibly can. The title of tonight's fireside is Hurricane Pass, and that's a story that I'll share with you in just a few minutes. And welcome. It is Wednesday night, April 28th, 2021, and my name is Glenn Rawson, and I thank you for joining me. Now, in case I haven't said it recently, I'm sure I have, the Glenn Rawson stories, all of the stories that I share with you are free. Every week, we send out an email to thousands of people that have these free stories. They're videotaped, they're set to music. Some of you are getting those. If you have not yet received the free stories, please sign up. I promise you, those stories are free. They're a gift of inspiration each week that comes right to your email. And you can also sign up and give them to someone else, like for Mother's Day or something like that. Now, the next thing I wanted to mention, my friends are serving at winter quarters and at the Mormon Battalion Visitor Center in San Diego. Those two visitor centers will open up, as it were, on the 28th of May. But in the meantime, you're welcome to take a virtual tour of both of those places. The Bennetts at winter quarters and the sisters serving in San Diego would love to have you sign up for a virtual tour. And I've been to both of these places in person. I highly recommend that if you have not yet done that, take a virtual tour of both places. Now, next thing. On Friday, those of you that are interested in going with me on vacation to Costa Rica again, we're having a question and answer session about noon on Friday, this coming Friday, to talk about our Costa Rica trip. It would really be a lot of fun. Even if you're not going to go, you could learn a lot about the country and maybe learn a few things that might be of use to you later on. So we're having a Costa Rica question and answer session this Friday about noon. All right. Oh, and that's on Glenn Rawson Stories Facebook. Now let me get into the stories themselves. I remember hearing, and it might have been one of those Elder Maxwell quotes that I'm ruining, but I remember hearing once that it is our attitude, not our aptitude, that will ultimately determine our altitude. I think I said that right. Well, this next story is about being of good cheer. All right. Eliza Edmonds Hewitt. Oh, let's see. Okay. It wasn't Annie. Don't worry. I think I'm centered or close enough that Annie's not yelling at me. Eliza Edmonds Hewitt was born June 28, 1851, the daughter of Captain James Stratton Hewitt, Zorua Stites Edmund Hewitt. She was educated in a girls' normal school in Philadelphia, where she graduated as a valedictorian. She then took a position teaching public schools, and also served on the staff of the Northern Home for Friendless Children. She was, and I understand this, a teacher, and she loved children. Story is told, though, that one day while trying to correct a student, the student struck her on the back with the point of a slate, severely injuring her. She was thereafter put in a heavy cast for 6 months and confined to her bed. Her career was effectively over, and for quite some time, Eliza was an invalid. Now, just imagine this for a moment. The forced confinement, loss of a career, the bitterness, the disappointing circumstances, that could have made Eliza very bitter. She had more than enough reason to be angry at life and at God. But instead, Eliza chose to study English literature, and so she would pass the time studying and singing sacred songs. It is said that one warm spring day, after some measure of recovery, Eliza was allowed to go outside and take a walk through Fairmount Park. The blessed spring sunshine warmed her soul within and without, and Eliza returned to her bed and wrote one of her first of many hymns to follow. She wrote these words: "There is sunshine in my soul today, more glorious and bright than glows in any earthly sky, for Jesus is my light." Eliza Edmonds Hewitt loved the Lord and wrote many songs of glorious praise. It is noteworthy, at least to me, that Eliza, who could have succumbed to anger, pain, bitterness, chose instead to feel and to say, "There is gladness in my soul today, and hope and praise and love, for blessings which he gives me now, for joys laid up above." End of quote. My friends, we live in a time of pandemic and social suffering. So many have been isolated for so long. Isn't there a powerful lesson and example in this story relevant for all of us? I think there is, at least for me. You remember when the Apostle Paul said, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." This is one man's testimony of just that very truth. Martha Cox, who I believe is one of my relatives, tells the story of a family friend that used to come and stay with them while working on the St. George Temple in the 1870s. She called him Uncle Allen Stout. Now, Allen had been a friend and a bodyguard of the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. And because of that, Martha asked him many questions. And though Allen was not much to volunteer information, he would answer Martha's questions. By this means, she learned much about early church history. One day, Martha made a statement, quote, "that I thought it could not be possible for me to see a heavenly being," end of quote. Uncle Allen responded, she said, that she might see one without recognizing it as such, as happened once with him, end of quote. Well, of course, that stirred Martha's curiosity big time, and she wanted to know what had happened to him. And this was how he related it to her. "He told me he was once walking with the prophet on the west side of the Mississippi River on the road to Montrose. They saw a man walking along a road leading from the south and coming towards the prophet. The prophet told Allen to remain where he was while he stepped over to speak with this pedestrian," still quoting. "Allen turned his back towards Joseph and the stranger, and for a time forgot the prophet and became engaged with his own thoughts while he stood," quoting, "whipping a low bush with the cane he carried. The hand of the prophet upon his shoulder aroused him. The prophet said, 'We must return immediately to Nauvoo.' They walked silently and rapidly. Allen became very sorrowful over his recreancy to his duty and could not refrain from weeping. The prophet asked him why he wept. Allen confessed, 'I am an inefficient bodyguard, criminally neglectful of your welfare. I allowed that man you met to speak with you without being even ready to defend if he attacked you. He could have killed you and made his escape without my knowing who he is, which way he went, or what he even looks like. And then Allen continued, you will have to dispense with my services and take a guard on which you can depend. Your life is too precious to be trusted to my care. End of quote. The prophet then said, this is Martha now, the prophet then said, that man would not harm me. You saw John the Revelator. End of quote. Now, I don't want to say anything inappropriate, but I strongly believe what Paul said, that there are angels all about us, and sometimes they look just like normal, everyday people. And they are part of heaven and watching us and sent here to help us. Sometimes we see them, sometimes we hear them, but they are always there. Moving on. I don't usually make a habit out of telling the end of the story first, but in this case, it's probably necessary. The story I'm about to relate has been one of the most beloved pioneer stories since it was first told by William R. Palmer in 1943 in a radio broadcast in Cedar City, Utah. Now, by way of background, in 1856, and you know the story, 5 companies of Latter-day Saints crossed the Great Plains by handcart. Of those 5 companies, 3 passed successfully with little or no incident. But the last 2 companies, the Willie and Martin companies, were trapped by early, now I shouldn't say that, I get corrected every time. There's no such thing as early winter snow in October in Wyoming. That's not early, that's right on time. They were trapped by heavy winter snows on the high plains of Wyoming. Over 200 souls perished. Now that is a remarkable story of courage, faith, and compassion. And I'll speak about it again later on. One of the immigrants in the Martin Company was Francis Webster. Many years later, probably just after the turn of the 20th century, the following incident occurred as related by eyewitness William Palmer. He said, and I quote, I heard a testimony once that made me tingle to the roots of my hair. I was in an adult Sunday school class of over 50 men and women. The subject under discussion was the ill-fated handcart company that suffered so terribly in the snow in 1856. Some sharp criticism of the church and its leaders was being indulged in for permitting any company of converts to venture across the plains with no more supplies or protection than a handcart caravan afforded. You'll recognize the story right here. One old man in the corner sat silent and listened as long as he could stand it. Then he arose and said things that no person who heard him will ever forget. His face was white with emotion, yet he spoke calmly, deliberately, but with great earnestness and sincerity. He said, in substance, quote, I ask you to stop this criticism. You are discussing a matter you know nothing about. Cold historic facts mean nothing here, for they give no proper interpretation of the questions involved. Mistake? To send the handcart company out so late in the season? Yes. But I was in that company, and my wife was there too. We suffered beyond anything you can imagine, and many died of exposure and starvation. But did you ever hear a survivor of that company utter a word of criticism? Not one of that company, he said, ever apostatized or left the church, because every one of us came through with an absolute knowledge that God lives, for we became acquainted with him in our extremities. And then Webster continued, I have pulled my handcart when I was so weak and weary from illness and lack of food that I could hardly put one foot ahead of the other. I have looked ahead and seen a patch of sand or a hill slope, and I have said, I can go only that far, and there I must give up, for I cannot pull the load through it. I have gone on to that sand, and when I reached it, the cart began pushing me. I have looked back, Webster said, many times to see who was pushing my cart, but my eyes saw no one. I knew that the angels of God were there. Was I sorry that I chose to come by handcart? No. Neither then nor any minute of my life since. The price we paid to become acquainted with God was a privilege to pay, and I am thankful that I was privileged to come in the Martin Handcart Company. The speaker was Francis Webster, and when he sat down, Palmer said, there was not a dry eye in the room. We were a subdued and chastened lot. End of quote. Now, my friends, what I have related is the end of the story, and it is a powerful, instructive, and inspiring story that I have heard for decades. But if you knew the beginning of the story, the journey of Francis and Betsy Webster with the Martin Company, you would agree that this account is even more meaningful. Now, as Paul Harvey used to say, this is the rest of the story. Indeed, this is the beginning of the story. Francis Webster was born February the 8th, 1830, in England. He was born a sickly child with little chance of surviving to adulthood. When he was 18 years old, missionaries brought him the gospel. In the spring of 1852, Francis met Anne Elizabeth Betsy Parsons, his future wife. About a year later, Francis set out to make his fortune, with Betsy promising to wait for him until she was 21 years old. When Francis returned in the summer of 1855, it was with $2,000 in gold. December the 5th, 1855, Francis and Betsy were married. And like so many others, they were determined to gather with the saints in America. However, unlike so many others, Francis and Betsy now had the means to travel very comfortably across the plains. Francis arranged for a wagon, ox teams, and supplies to be waiting for them at the trailhead in Iowa. Betsy was expecting their first child. The year 1856 was hard for the church. Famine and drought had so reduced resources that it was determined that a cheaper means must be found in crossing the plains. Thus was launched the idea of the handcart companies. With the rest of the London branch traveling by handcart, could Francis and Betsy travel in relative comfort? Well, they counseled together and made the decision to give up their team, wagon, and possessions, their comfort, for a handcart. Moreover, as they prepared to leave for America, they took that money and paid the way for 9 other people to make the journey. July the 9th, 1856, Iowa City, Iowa. There were not enough handcarts ready for them. So Francis and Betsy chose to share their handcart with William and Amy Middleton, Betsy's mother and stepfather. Once again, the Websters were forced or chose to abandon more of their belongings. Not only that, now, William went to help with the supply wagons, effectively leaving Francis to pull the double-loaded handcart all alone. September the 15th, 1856, the Martin Company made their longest day's journey, pulling 22 miles. James Blake, also from England, the London branch, had been very ill and recorded the following on that day in his journal. Quote, I began to draw the handcart this morning, but was obliged to leave it. Brother Francis Webster very kindly persuaded me to ride on his handcart and drew me 17 miles, for which kindness I feel grateful and pray God to bless him with health and strength." End of quote. September the 27th, Betsy gave birth to a daughter whom they would name Amy. Time was critically short, however, and the next day the company pushed on. Betsy had to ride until she recovered. At this same time, the trail passed through the sandhills of Nebraska. Francis would later speak of struggling to pull his handcart through deep sand and looking back for the angels assisting him. That's where it happened. October the 19th, 1856, the storms caught the Martin Handcart Company on the high plains of Wyoming near the Platte River. Clothing and rations were woefully inadequate to fortify them against the bitter cold. Rescue parties would later describe the awful scene. Quote, "You can imagine between 500 and 600 men, women, and children worn down by drawing their handcarts through snow and mud, fainting by the wayside, chilled by the cold, children crying, their limbs stiffened by cold, their feet bleeding. The sight is almost too much for the stoutest of us." End of quote. So said the rescuers. Francis and Betsy Webster would be among those who suffered. Francis wrote, "My own feet were badly frozen on the journey." The Websters reached Salt Lake City on November 30th, 1856. Within 2 days, they would be on their way to Cedar City, Utah, where they would live out the remainder of their days in distinguished service. It was shortly before Francis Webster died that he bore that remarkable testimony in Sunday school. Knowing that Francis and Betsy Webster didn't have to come by handcart, that they paid passage for 9 others, and that they helped others along the way and gave up their belongings and arrived in the valley with virtually nothing, having left it all along the trail, and for the rest of their lives refused to murmur, but continued to serve and sacrifice and help others, not only on the trail, but for the rest of their days in Cedar City, makes Francis Webster's testimony in Sunday school even more worthy of the legendary status it has attained. Now, in case you would like more information on this and sources, my friend, historian Chad Orton, published an article on Francis Webster in the BYU Studies in 2006. There you'll find the sources well researched on the details I've given you. All right, let's take a break for just a moment. Annie, I hope you can help me with the links, but Dennis wanted me to remind you guys that it's called the Hope Bundle. This collection of books on historyofthesaints.org is called the Hope Bundle. It's The Secret Keepers and Down But Not Out by Susan Easton Black, and then Finding Hope in the Journey and Survey's Song, all by Heidi Tucker. These 4 books are the Hope Bundle. They're available there, and Dennis wanted me to tell you, if you want these for Mother's Day, sorry, but you got to hurry, because Mother's Day is May 9th, and if you want them shipped to you, he has to get on it right now. So not to be a nudge, but if you want these for Mother's Day, Dennis said you got to hurry. Secondly, same thing here. For those of you that are looking for these collections of stories, the Witnesses Bundle, it's also available there, but you got to hurry if you want it for Mother's Day. All right, that's enough of that. I'm a lousy salesman. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you was that, and I know I keep saying this, but all of you that are VIPs and all of you that are buying these books, some people will fund their project by just asking for donations. Well, we choose instead to make these books and DVDs and everything we're doing, the free stories and the VIP. Well, we choose to try to give you something for that. But I want you to know that I am grateful, especially to you VIPs, for your help, for your funding. It's you that are driving this machine and paying for this research. And these firesides are just a little way of giving some of it back. I am very grateful to all of you for what you're doing. And if any of you are interested in becoming a VIP and supporting this work, go to glennrawsonstories.com, and there's a way there for you to do that. But even if you don't, please stay here, tune into the firesides, and I'll give you everything I can. All right. You doing okay? Are we, I hope this setting doesn't bother you, doesn't distract. I know there's some that don't really care for it, but you know what? Tonight, I am very, very comfortable. Not like some other nights when I've been teaching. All right. Recently, President Nelson asked us again to immerse ourselves in the scriptures to strengthen our faith. He keeps using that word immerse, not study, not read, immerse. I've done a lot of thinking about that. And before that, he invited us to do the same thing, immerse ourselves in the scriptures as a way of enabling us to hear him. Well, how in the world do you immerse yourself in the scriptures? Well, I would like to share a story that's true, but at the same time, you know me, it's a parable about possibly how we can do that. How many times in your life have you said, I want to be a scriptorian? And you came home from church and you went to work with all the passion and the zeal. You went to work over the scriptures. Possibly you picked up the Book of Mormon. And then, after a few days, that passion began to wane and, well, you know the rest of the story. And that's why there aren't that many scriptorians out there. Who's going to stick to it? Well, here's the story. About 25 years ago, longer than that now, closer to 35 years ago, I flew for the first time across the Colorado Rockies. I remember that first flight. I sat there with my nose pressed against the window, taking in the magnificent scenery below me. It was fun the first time I flew, staring down at the world below. But then, after hundreds of flights, it became kind of boring. Looking out the airplane window, it all looked the same. Well, yeah, there were variations in color and texture, but from 35,000 feet, the landscape all looks pretty much the same. I came to realize that seeing the Rocky Mountains from the air is a little like getting a kiss through a screen door. It's nice, but you sort of lose something. Now, contrast. My daughter, Cherise, my oldest daughter, and I determined some time back that we were going to see the Tetons really up close. I look back on it now, I think we were nuts. Our goal was to run up and over Hurricane Pass, right just north of the Three Tetons in the Teton Range. That trail crosses over the entire range from the Idaho side and to the Wyoming side and is 22 miles long. Did I mention we were going to run it, not hike it? Well, we set out. Yeah, we were really full of fire. Now, to be honest, we both knew we couldn't run the entire 22 miles up over a mountain range. Some of the trail was just too steep and rugged, but we did try. We ran most of the way. Oh, and you know what? It was fun. We ran through the thick pine forests along the valley floor. I love the smell of pine. Then we started climbing up, reaching the open hillsides that at that time were just laden with wildflowers. The color and the contrast, oh, it was beautiful. And then we got up on top, the picture I put on Facebook. We got up on top where the high mountain lakes and the rocky terrain, and we were above the tree line, and oh, mama, the view. Finally, we reached the very top and crossed over the Skyline Trail. The view looking down, the Tetons so close it was as though we could reach out and touch them, the clear mountain air, oh, it was utterly magnificent. Now, up to this point, our journey had been nothing but uninterrupted joy. A lot of sweat, but uninterrupted joy. But that all changed when we started down the other side. The trail was steep on the other side and rough. There were places we couldn't safely run. Even at that, Cherise rolled her ankle twice. We ran out of water. And worst of all, darkness fell before we got down to the bottom and reached the lake. Those last few miles were a struggle that brought us to the point of exhaustion. We hurt so bad by the time we hit the bottom near Jenny's Lake, I can't even tell you. That last few miles we were walking, holding on to one another for support, and singing sacred songs to keep us going. Finally, by following the faint beam of a cell phone light, we finally found the family and were safe, completely spent and in terrible pain, but happy. We did it. We did it. And given the circumstances, we'd do it again. We experienced firsthand every sight, sound, smell, and step of the Tetons and Hurricane Pass. You can't see that from an airplane. You can't experience that from a car from a long ways off. I have flown over and around the Tetons on more than one occasion in an aircraft, but nothing compares with getting down in them, smelling the trees, the flowers, touch, taste, smell, feel, experience everything up close. Memories in the mountains are made in them, not above them, and certainly not from the comfort of a car. My friends, mountains are just like scriptures. You have to get down in them with your nose, figuratively speaking, inches from the page. Study every word, preposition, every comma. Ponder what the prophet meant. What was going through his mind? What caused him to say that? Get down to the details. Too many of us read our scriptures like flying over the mountains in a jet. We sit down and off we go, eager to get to our destination, the other end of the chapter, the other end of the book. There's no passion. There's no quest. Nor is there any sense of the topography, of the characters, the story, the history, the drama that's in the book right underneath us. Just as texture, shadow, and perspective of Mother Earth are best experienced up close, so too is it the same with the scriptures. They become a passion when we slow down, bend our backs, put our nose to the page, and start exploring every word, phrase, and character. It will be frustrating, even painful. No one can study the Word of God like this and not be affected deeply. The Scriptures will invade your spiritual senses just as the smell of pine in a forest can assault you. But oh, the adventures you can have. So, do you want to immerse yourself in the Scriptures? All right. Bend your back, and get ready and put out some effort. Climb the Grand. Take a hike through the mountains of Isaiah. You'll love what you see. And don't be deterred. If you can stick to it, we'll see you on the other side. Weary, glassy-eyed maybe, but a changed person. Next story. I hesitated whether or not to say this to introduce this next story, and I hope this isn't inappropriate or a turnoff to you, but I understand very well, and I'm not eliciting sympathy. I understand a little of how perfect and powerful God is, and I also understand how far away from that I am. When drawing the comparison between me and Him, well, I'm created in His image, but beyond that, I'm afraid there's not much similarity. I will never be good enough, worthy enough of my own accord. There is one thing, though, that I can give Him. I can't give Him perfection. I can't even give Him good enough to be called worthy most of the time. But there is one thing I can give Him. There will be one good thing that I can do with all of my heart and soul, and that is teach the gospel, be a missionary, and bring souls unto Christ. Any dummy can do that, and I can qualify there. That's my joy. Here's a story about just that. Someone helping someone else, and by so doing, saving themselves. George Housley left England with his mother for America on the horizon in 1856. George was 19 years old. By that summer, this is again the story I told you earlier, they found themselves at Iowa City awaiting a handcart to cross the plains to Salt Lake. A man came up to them and warned George and his mother not to go, because if they did, they would starve to death. George was sorely tempted to stay behind with a few others, but it was made known to him and his mother that they were to go on. So go on they did. George and his mother set out in high spirits, singing as they went as they left Iowa City. They were part of the Martin Handcart Company. However, by the time they reached the Sweetwater River in Wyoming, some 2.5 months later, their joyous singing had been hushed for desperate prayers. George described their rations being reduced to 4 ounces of flour a day, a half a cup. People were starving and freezing and dying all around them. Finally, it all became too much for George. Quote, "I became so despondent through weakness," he said, "that I longed for death and tried to hide myself from the company that I might die." George went some distance from the camp and sat down behind a rock and prayed to die. Sometime later, a man rode up on a dark horse, found George, wrapped him in a blanket, and put him on that horse and took him back to safety. Well, George would live on, come to Utah, and become the father of 15 children and 94 grandchildren. Decades later, George, now an old man, was at a family gathering. Marshall Frank Allen, the other grandfather of his granddaughter, Clarissa, was sharing his experiences from the trail. He spoke of the call that came from President Young. This is Marshall Allen. He spoke of the call that came from President Brigham Young in October 1856 to go out and rescue the handcart people. He said at that time he thought it was a foolish thing to go out in such weather with no roads to follow, but that he would make it a matter of prayer. Marshall did. And it was made known to him that he must go, and in so doing would save many lives. Accordingly, he rode out into the storm into Wyoming. It was terrible conditions. Some of the company turned back and urged Marshal Frank Allen to do the same. But he vowed he would ride all the way to the States, meaning all the way to the Missouri River if he had to find them. He told how a short time later he rode into the Martin Company camp and how it occurred to him that there might be someone else farther back along the trail. And then Allen told of riding back and seeing a dark spot on a hillside some distance away. He rode toward it and discovered it to be a young man near death. Frank Allen described that he dismounted his horse. And at this point, as Frank is telling the story, Grandfather Housley spoke up. "Your horse was a bay with one white foot and a white star on its forehead." Grandfather Allen said, "Yes." "And your blanket was red and black plaid." "How did you know that?" asked Grandfather Allen. "Because I was that young man," said George Housley. By Frank's efforts to save a stranger, he preserved a great posterity, including some of his own. It is true on many levels. In our efforts to save others, we save ourselves. I might say, I am grateful to all of you that join me for these firesides on Wednesdays and Sunday nights. You have become a small congregation, as it were, a small community. And I love how you're kind to each other, supportive, encouraging. You pray for one another. You even contact one another outside these firesides, and some of you have become good friends. That means a lot. Thank you. Next story. By small means, in many instances, the Lord confounds the wise and works miracles. Some miracles in this world today are so small and so commonplace as to be mislabeled as discoveries. This story I'm going to share comes from my friend John Watson. This, he said, I heard it with my own ears. In the early 1970s, John Watson, a Latter-day Saint, was teaching school in Simi Valley, California. President Harold B. Lee came to their stake conference. Between leadership meetings, everyone took a break. John came into a hallway in the building and found two men talking. Now, he said, perhaps not fully understanding how much the local valley's economy actually depended on the aerospace program, they were discussing the horror of how much money was being shot off into space. You get the scene? Two men running down the aerospace industry that was centered there in Simi Valley, California, and as they're griping about it, John walks up and hears them. Then John described what happened next, quoting, Elder Lee came out of the restroom, Harold B. Lee came out of the restroom and stopped at the water fountain. He took a handful of pills, tablets, and capsules from his pocket and sorted them to his satisfaction. Some he returned to his pocket, and others he washed down with a drink of water and started up the hall. He had taken 3 or 4 steps when he stopped. From where I stood, I had a perfect view, and to me, his body language was, do I or don't I? Then John said he turned and came back to where those two men were talking, and he said, quote, Brethren, please forgive my interruption, but I could not help but hear what you are discussing. He then, John said, wagged his finger back and forth in front of their faces and continued, do not begrudge not one dime what is being spent in the aerospace industry. It will yet be the means of spreading the gospel in a manner you cannot now dream of. End of quote. And then John said can you imagine? He nodded his head to them and turned to go back to his meeting. John heard the prophecy and he took note. He then goes on to describe that at that time in California, they were able to get, quote, 1 hour of general conference on a 2-week delay. Now, let me just step in. Do you remember those days when we all listened to priesthood sessions by telephone hookup? And then there came cooperative television networks that would broadcast it. And now, through satellite link, we can listen in real time to prophets of God in the comfort of our own home across the world, all at the same time and in our own languages. As John pointed out, just consider the impact that computers have had on the gathering of Israel on both sides of the veil. Can you imagine the feelings of those pioneers who came from all across the world to Utah just so they could hear prophets of God in real time and speak? Can you imagine what they'd say now as they watch us meet and listen with Zoom and FaceTime calls and never leave the comfort of our living room? John concluded his story this way, quote, "The list goes on and on. The last being the changes COVID-19 has foisted upon us while we sit in our own homes and participate in not only general conference, but our weekly sacrament and auxiliary meetings via technology from the aerospace industry. I have probably said 1,000 times, I have seen a greater fulfillment of Harold B. Lee's prophecy, and to think, he said, I overheard it with my own ears." End of quote. I share that story with you, even though John gave me permission. I share that story with you with the idea in mind that it isn't lost on me that these broadcasts right here, right now, via Facebook, with a little old simple camera sitting in my office, are being listened to all across the world. Europe, South America, Asia, everywhere. People are listening right now. It's a miracle, and I'm grateful. Last story for tonight. I've said it here many times before, and I hope you don't misunderstand what I'm going to say. I am fascinated by power. I always have been. I'm intrigued by it. You could call me a power-hungry fool, but it is not the power of wealth and fame or even politics and popularity that I want. I don't care a spit about that. But the power to know peace, move mountains of misery, to love as God loves. I want the power to lay hold upon those things. And not only that, for me, but to share it with my family and with others. This story I'm going to share with you now is one of my most favorite stories in all of Scripture from the life of the Savior. It began on the beach at Capernaum. As Jesus came ashore, the people were waiting for him. Among them was Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue there, who fell at his feet and announced that his only daughter lay dying. "I pray thee," Jairus said, "come and lay thy hands on her that she may be healed, and she shall live." End of quote. Well, Jesus agreed to go. Now, thronged by a crowd anxious to see Jesus perform the miracles they've heard so much about, began to follow him. And this is where I've been to Capernaum. I've stood on that beach. And I can envision that street, that very beach up which he would have walked following Jairus into the city. Now within that crowd there was a woman afflicted with an incurable disease, some manner of blood disorder. For 12 years she had suffered many things at the hands of many physicians, and was not healed, but was more sickly than ever. Somehow, we don't know when or where, but she learned of the power of the great healer. Faith was awakened within her, and she determined to go to him. However, because of the nature of her illness, she was unclean, and under the Mosaic law was ashamed to ask for the Savior's help. As Jesus passed by her in the crowd, she said to herself, quote, "If I may but touch the hem of his garment, I shall be whole." It must have taken considerable effort and faith, especially for a weak and sickly woman, to get through the crowd and reach Jesus. Moreover, the distance from the lake's shore to the city is not that far. The woman had no time to dally or to waste with indecision. She pushed her way through, and from behind touched the hem of the Master's robe. Immediately there was a tangible surge of power that flowed throughout her body. She was fully healed from that very moment, and she knew it. Jesus stopped and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, Peter said to him, in effect, "There's all these people around, pushing and shoving, and you asked, 'Who touched me?'" But her touch was different from everyone else. Hers was a touch of faith and supplication that brought forth his divine power, and he felt it. "I perceive," Jesus said, "that virtue or power is gone out of me." The woman, knowing that she was discovered, came forward and fell at the Master's feet, confessing before all what she had done. With intimate kindness and tenderness, Jesus commended her. "Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace." How much like that woman are we, you, me? In our time, President Russell M. Nelson has invited us to hear him, and then he added this: "As we seek to be disciples of Jesus Christ, our efforts to hear him need to be ever more intentional. It takes conscious and consistent effort to fill our daily lives with his words, his teachings, his truths. We simply cannot rely upon information we bump into on social media." End of quote. I've thought so much about that woman. We are like her, mostly nameless and faceless in a very large, crowded, confused world. Yet to the Lord Jesus Christ, you matter. And he has time and love enough for you. Like her, we all have hidden ailments, miseries, mountains of misery that come with mortality and steal from us our happiness, our peace, and power. Ailments that the wisdom of the world can't fix. However, whether or not we put forth the intentional effort to draw near unto him, well, that's our choice. It is for us as it was for the woman healed from her issue of blood. With the presence of social media, it is as though there's a loud, pushing crowd about us, demanding with an incessant cacophony our constant attention. Will we tune them out and with single-minded determination fight our way to the Savior's side, where we can hear him and receive his power and peace? The woman's enduring and endearing proof of faith was that she fought her way into his presence and touched him with real intent and full purpose of heart. I hope and I pray that it may be the same with us. No matter what it takes, may we reach his side and receive his power. Good night, and God bless.